Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning. This is David Goldstein from Mekko Graphics. I am here to give you a webinar today on 10 ways to use a cascade chart. The webinar will be about 30 minutes. I probably have about 15, 20 minutes worth of content, and then we'll save some time for questions at the end. Feel free to, during the webinar, one of my colleagues will be monitoring the question section of the GoToWebinar, so you feel free to ask questions then. We will try to answer some of them in real time and maybe save some of them for the end. And if you want to save your questions till the end, I will be available to answer them at that time. Basically, what we're going to do today is go through a few different ways that you can use a cascade chart. The cascade or waterfall or bridge chart is probably one of the most useful charts that you can do with Mekko Graphics, and it has a bunch of different use cases. We'll just show you some use cases. I don't think all 10 will be useful for any individual on the call, but I'm hoping that you walk away with maybe one or two or three ways that you might use a cascade chart in the future that you haven't used it to date. This isn't an introductory webinar, so I'm not going to show you how to make a cascade chart. We do have a video on how to make a cascade chart on our website. If you've got questions about specific charts or how I did a specific feature on a chart, feel free to ask me, and I can do that at the end. But the webinar itself will be more focused on looking at the charts, explaining their usage, and showing you when they can best be used. So that's where we're going. Let me get going. Let me just jump right in and move to the first chart. So the first chart I want to show you is a classic waterfall chart. It's a waterfall chart for an income statement. And you can see that it sort of fits the mode of waterfall, starting with the big number revenue and then subtracting out your costs and getting eventually down to net income in the on the right-hand side of the chart. A couple of things that are of note on this chart. One is that we have a bunch of intermediate totals: gross margin, operating income, income before taxes, and we included them in the chart. Those are in the kind of a grayish color. A second is that we have a split of revenue and cost of revenue into product and service, and we did that just in the first two bars, and we added a little custom legend to show what those two different colors meant. And that gives you a little extra data. If you sort of want to get in and look at this chart real closely, you can see that I think this is Microsoft, that its revenue was about equally split, maybe a little more from product than from service and other, but the cost of revenue is much more strongly skewed to service and other than to product. Another thing to note on this chart is that we added a couple of data rows to the bottom of a chart. I like using data rows on many of my charts, especially on the Cascade chart. We did a couple of things in the data row. One is we added percent of revenue, which just clarifies the magnitude of all of these cost items. And the second is we added another dimension of data. This cascade chart is very static. It's just looking at revenue, just looking at profit and loss for one time period. But if you wanted to show year-over-year growth in these categories, you can do that right here with this extra data row at the bottom of the chart. So just a couple things on that chart that I wanted to show you. I'm going to move on to the next. The next is another very common use of a cascade chart. And here we're looking at change versus prior period. This is probably the use case that I see most from our customers. You've got your Q4 revenues or your Q4 profits, and you want to turn them into your Q1 revenues or Q4 following year revenues or profits, and you want to know why it changed. You want to split out that change. So here's an example from Apple, and we split it out in two ways. One was by segment, so you can see here that services contributed most to growth, and the second was by region, and you can see here that that Americas contributed most to growth. In terms of making the chart, just a couple of things I wanted to highlight. Well, really three things. One is the axis breaks, which I again use fairly frequently in these charts, and these will shrink these larger bars and let you focus on the change bars. If I didn't have this axis break in the chart, these the Q4 revenue numbers would be very large, and you really would have trouble differentiating among the different growth segments. And the second is I used color. I tried to make the largest area pop. In this case, services and Americas. I both made in an orange to stand out from everything else, which was just in a shade of blue. So let me move on to the next to show you a third example. So here again, we are looking at change and trying to explain why a change occurred. And here I'm looking at change from historic, and then in a second time period projected. So I'm looking at change in working age population starting in 1995 and how it grew basically 25% between 1995 and 2015, and where that growth came from. Seems like mostly from immigrants and US born with US born parents. And then I'm looking at projected change. So here I'm looking at growth between 15 and 35. And here that growth is going to be less, as you can see in the two bar comparison lines that I added with the percentages in them. And B, the change in growth is much more focused around US born to immigrant parents, and much less on the other two categories. So in terms of features for this chart, I wanted to in terms of use case, I wanted to point out that you can have multiple time periods and use this chart to show not just change between Q1 and Q2, but change between Q1, Q2, and Q3. In this case, change between 1995 to 2015, and then 2015 to 2035. Second, I wanted to show that I wanted to highlight the overall change, and I used these bar comparison lines to do that. Third, I used the axis breaks again to shrink these total bars so I can focus on the magnitude of the change bars. Sometimes I'll use these links between segments, these little dashed lines. I think they're helpful. In some of the other examples, I don't have them, and it's more of a style thing. And lastly, in terms of axes, I used an x-axis title, basically almost as a chart title at the bottom of the slide. I've got all the bar labels on my x-axis, and I try to use very long explanatory bar labels in this case, and gave a lot of room for multi-line bar labels. And in a lot of my Cascade charts, I won't have a y-axis. It usually isn't necessary. And here's an example where it's just not there, just hidden. So that's my third chart. Next chart I wanted to show you is a chart that we use internally. Here in chart 3, I'm comparing history to projection. In chart 4 here, I'm comparing actual to plan. This is a chart. We use a variant of this chart internally to track our sales against target. I think this can be a really powerful chart. So here I've got a sales target of $1.75 billion. I've got a sales pipeline, and I've got 5 different stages to my sales pipeline, and I'm estimating the amount of revenue I'm going to receive from each of the from the prospects in each stage of the sales pipeline, and that's split up here, and that gives me a total pipeline value. But then if I want to meet my sales target, I need to add, I've got to close this gap. So this is a really nice kind of motivating chart for a sales team to show them what they need to do, what they need to close from the different stages of the pipeline that are in the pipeline, and what they need to add to the pipeline to reach their sales target. And again, I added a percent of sales target to as a data row to the bottom of the chart. No need, and I really wouldn't advise an axis break in this chart. Let me go on to the next. I'm making good time, which is nice. Gives you a little more time for questions at the end. So another sort of classic use of cascade or waterfall chart. Here's a use that's more likely you'll see from your internal consulting team, or if you're a consultant presenting to your clients. You're showing, you're projecting, you're coming in with a project that's going to increase your earnings before interest and taxes from 9.2% of your revenue to 10.75% of your revenue. And you want to say, where are those changes going to come from? And we use the waterfall, the cascade, to split up those changes into different categories. And then I assume in subsequent charts, you can dive in and show how you're going to optimize your product portfolio, your price mix, your material cost, and these other features. So here I added a couple of things. Again, the bar comparison line, which shows that my overall improvement in earnings before interest and tax margin is going to be 17%. And the other, again, the axis breaks, so I can focus on these change bars. Here's a chart I created for our chart of the week. If you don't subscribe to the chart of the week, I would recommend that. We do have a link on the last slide for a chart of the week. So here I'm using the cascade to show cost comparison. So that here the cost comparison is running from the cost of college, and this is in the U.S. Difference between a public 4-year college, which typically costs about $25,000 a year, and a private nonprofit 4-year college, which costs more than double that, about over $52,000 a year. And we want to say, why is the total cost so much higher? And you can see I used a stacked cascade here to split out the $25,000 into tuition and fees, room and board, and other expenses, which are down here in the legend, as mentioned in the legend as well. And I've split out the 4-year cost again in terms of tuition, fees, room and board, and other expenses. And just to emphasize where the growth came from, I showed the difference in tuition and fees, room and board, and other expenses here in this in the steps of the cascade chart. You could have done this chart in a stacked bar chart, and I think I even have. If you bear with me for a second, I can show you. I made a little example over here. This is what this chart would have looked like in a stacked bar chart to show the growth. And this is not an unreasonable way to show the growth, but I think to make it a little more emphatic, to really drive home this tuition and fees component, then switching it to the stacked cascade is a worthwhile change. Uh, Another sort of a different use of the cascade or waterfall chart. Here, I'm using it as a what we call a build-up cascade to try to understand what are the components of a total cost. So here, the total cost I wanted to get to was the cost of a fully loaded Mac desktop. So believe it or not, the most expensive fully loaded Mac desktop cost around a little under $53,000, almost as much as a year's tuition at a private nonprofit college from the last slide. And that number blew me away, and I wanted to understand, what made up that cost, and I wanted to display that graphically. So I'm building up to that cost from the base configuration, adding the processor upgrade, the biggest component, the memory upgrade, graphics upgrade, storage upgrade, and other stuff. And a couple of things I did with this chart. One is I added the data rows to the bottom of the chart. So I wanted to use the data rows. One of the nice things about the data rows is they don't have to have numbers in them. So my headings here, base includes and fully loaded includes, and then I've got text in my data rows. So I split up my whole chart area. I moved my chart to make just about half the size of the just about half the size of the chart area. And then I added these very text-heavy data rows to the bottom, and this really helps explain why the costs are so much. I'm going from 32 gig base memory to 1.5 terabytes in my fully loaded configuration. So again, sort of the build up with the data rows is a nice combination there. Few more charts just to sort of round out the examples. You can use the cascade to compare different investment options. And interesting in this chart, couple things. One is you can start your cascade negative. So I started my cascade with the initial investment, and then I added my earnings for each of the 4 years, and I summed them up into my net return. I did this for 4 different projects. Typically, when I make a chart like this, I would do the one first, and then basically just copy paste the chart and then apply the new data. And when I do that, if I line them up, you can see my x-axis aligned, and my project 3 is right under project 1, and the chart looks really nice. The other thing I did was I used a manual y-axis, which I set the same for each of the 4 charts, so the magnitude of each bar is going to be the same on each chart. So the 15 million in year 1 for project 1 is the same size as the 15 million in year 3 for project 3. So it's important to do that if you're going to do these comparisons, because you don't want to overemphasize one chart relative to the others. A couple more quick things that I wanted to show you, just wrapping up, because I said I was going to be about 20 minutes, and I'm going to be about 20 minutes. The same notion we had in chart 2 to show change in revenue from one quarter to the next, we can also use to show change in other measures. So here I'm using this to show change in CO2 emissions, and again I'm splitting it by region. So we can see that China and the US and India contribute most to those emissions growth. And then I'm doing it by category. And here you can see it's economic growth that's really driving emissions change, and that's being reduced by these energy conservation moves that we're making. And again, I use the axis breaks in this chart as well. And last, I wanted to show one more build-up cascade, one more segmentation chart. And here we're segmenting the market. We're segmenting the global 100 companies, and we're segmenting them by country. And you can see very clearly that more than half of those companies and way more than half of the value is coming from the US. China is the next biggest, and then all the other European countries and countries in the rest of the world have a many fewer global 100 companies. So this kind of cascade or waterfall chart, in my mind, is an alternative to a pie chart, an alternative to a single bar, 100% stacked bar chart. I think it works better than those charts in many instances. In an instance like this, if I had this as a pie chart, these would be very, very thin pie slices and very hard to see. When I split it up into a cascade chart, each of the segments is very easy to see, and its relative size, I think, is easier to see. Second, I can add these extra data as data rows to the bottom, which help explain the chart. So whenever you've got more than one category, more than say 5 or 6 categories in a pie chart, or if some of those categories are really small, if you want to put supplemental data in there, then using the cascade as an alternative to the pie can be really useful. So those are my 10. I hope those were useful. I hope again that from them you've got 1 or 2 or 3 different ideas that that could be useful for you. A couple of tips in terms of how to make these charts. One is that in Mekko graphics, we do have this function called switch bars and series. So if the data for your cascade is more laid out in multiple rows, yet on a single column, then you can use switch bars and series. You don't have to transpose the data into one row. You can use format bars and series to better organize your data, to handle your data rows, to remove rows that you don't want to show in your chart. And you can use the stacked bar if you've got a total bar or any bar that you want to split into multiple components. So using the stacked bar, typically a legend with the stacked bars in the cascade is really useful. And again, using colors to help differentiate or help make things stand out in a cascade is also very useful. So just wrapping up, just a couple things. If you want to learn more about cascade charts, we've got a nice page about cascades on our website. We've got a 90-minute training webinar if you want to learn more introductory, how to use Mekko graphics. We also have a bunch of short videos on our website, how to build a cascade, how to build a Mekko chart. So these also can be very useful. I'm going to put a plug in for my chart of the week. A lot of the charts that you saw in this deck came from the chart of the week. I try to be a little innovative and show you different chart options. We also have a blog on how to build charts called Build Your CQ, which we publish to periodically and try to answer common questions to support. And we also have an Ask an Expert button on our in Mekko graphics that you can use if you want to send us a question, and we will reply to it. If you don't know about our chart gallery is here. Very nice, searchable, easy to find examples of cascade charts. Many of the cascade charts that I use today are in this are in here. You can right click on any of these charts and add them to your deck. We're also going to send you this deck so you can have access to it, and we're also going to post this this video, the video from the session on the website, so you'll be able to share the webinar with colleagues who weren't able to attend. So I'm going to wrap up. I wanted to thank you all. I am going to stick around. So if you have questions, feel free to type them into the questions. I will stick around to answer them. And again, thank you. And thank you for using our software. And thank you for your attention. Have a great rest of your day.